David Rodriguez had been staring at the same spreadsheet for the past 2 hours, watching the numbers blur together as his eyes grew tired. The fluorescent lights above his cramped desk buzzed with that annoying hum that seemed to get louder as the day dragged on. 3 years. 3 long years he'd been working at Pinnacle Corporation, and still, he sat in the same corner cubicle, doing the same data analysis work while watching less qualified people get promoted around him. It wasn't that David was bitter exactly. Well, maybe a little. He'd submitted at least a dozen innovative proposals to improve company efficiency, each one meticulously researched and perfectly formatted. Most never got a response. The few that did received generic replies about keeping ideas on file for future consideration. Meanwhile, he watched as his manager's nephew got fast-tracked to senior analyst after just 8 months on the job. The office Christmas party was tonight, and honestly, David was considering skipping it. These corporate events were always the same: forced small talk, lukewarm appetizers, and the inevitable moment when CEO Robert Sterling would make some grand speech about company values while treating his employees like disposable resources. The other 364 days of the year, David's phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "How's work going? Still dealing with that horrible boss?" She knew all about Sterling's reputation from David's frustrated phone calls over the years. The man had a talent for making people feel small, especially during meetings where he'd publicly tear apart ideas without offering any constructive feedback. "Same as always," David typed back. "Company party tonight. Trying to decide if it's worth my time." "Go," she replied almost instantly. "You never know what might happen." "Maybe it's time to shake things up." David smiled slightly.
His sister always was the optimist in the family.
She didn't know about his secret, though. None of his co-workers did. How could he explain that before spreadsheets and corporate meetings, his life had been filled with something entirely different? The memories came flooding back as they always did when he let his guard down. Practice rooms filled with the sound of scales and arpeggios, the weight of piano keys beneath his fingers, the rush of performing in front of hundreds of people, feeling completely alive in a way he hadn't experienced in years. David had been a child prodigy, though he hated that term. It made him sound like some circus act rather than someone who simply loved music more than breathing. He'd started playing at 4 years old, not because his parents pushed him, but because he'd climbed onto the piano bench at his grandmother's house and somehow figured out Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star by ear. By age 10, he was performing with local orchestras. By 15, he'd won 3 national competitions and had performed at some of the most prestigious venues in the country. Music schools were fighting over him, offering full scholarships and promising bright futures in concert halls around the world. Then life happened. His father's construction business collapsed during the recession. His mother got sick, really sick, and the medical bills piled up faster than they could manage. David watched his parents stress about money every single day, seeing them age years in a matter of months. The full scholarship to Juilliard suddenly seemed selfish when his family was drowning in debt, so he made a choice. Instead of pursuing music, he studied business and finance, practical subjects that led to steady jobs with regular paychecks. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd go back to music once his family was stable. But temporary turned into permanent and steady became stuck. Now at 28, David felt like he was living someone else's life. He hadn't touched a piano in almost 2 years, not since he'd sold his beloved Yamaha upright to help his parents catch up on their mortgage payments. Sometimes he'd find his fingers moving on his desk, playing invisible melodies while he worked on quarterly reports. His co-workers had no idea. To them, he was just quiet David from accounting, the guy who brought homemade lunch every day and never joined them for after-work drinks. They didn't know that he could play Rachmaninoff from memory, or that he'd once received a standing ovation at Carnegie Hall. The workday finally ended, and David found himself reluctantly walking toward the elevator with everyone else heading to the party. The venue was fancy, some upscale hotel ballroom that probably cost more than David's annual salary. Sterling spared no expense when it came to impressing clients and board members, even if he couldn't be bothered to fix the broken air conditioning in the office. The ballroom was already crowded when David arrived. People clustered around high tables making small talk over glasses of wine and fancy appetizers he couldn't pronounce. He grabbed a soda from the bar and found a quiet corner, where he could observe without having to participate in too much conversation. Sterling was holding court near the center of the room, telling some story that had his inner circle laughing a bit too loudly. The man was in his 50s, with silver hair that always looked perfectly styled and suits that probably cost more than David's car. He had that particular brand of confidence that came from never having to worry about money or job security. David was checking his watch, calculating how long he needed to stay to be polite, when he noticed something in the corner of the ballroom, a grand piano black and gleaming under the chandeliers. It was clearly there for decoration, probably hired along with the venue, but David felt drawn to it like a magnet. He'd been avoiding pianos for months now. Too painful, but something about this one was different. Maybe it was the way the light hit the keys, or maybe it was just the wine talking from the glass he'd switched to after his soda. He found himself walking over, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. The piano was a Steinway, he realized as he got closer. A beautiful instrument, probably worth more than his house. David's fingers twitched with muscle memory as he imagined what it would feel like to play again, just once. Admiring the furniture, David turned to find Sterling standing behind him, that trademark smirk on his face. Several other executives had followed him over, creating a small audience that made David's stomach clench with anxiety. "It's a beautiful instrument," David said quietly, trying to step away. "Oh, you know about pianos?" Sterling's voice had that mocking tone David had heard in countless meetings. "Let me guess, you took lessons as a kid? Maybe played chopsticks at a school recital?" The group around Sterling chuckled, and David felt his face flush. He started to walk away, but Sterling's next word stopped him cold. Wait, Sterling called out, his voice getting louder and drawing attention from nearby conversations. "This is perfect. Look, everyone, our little David here is a piano player." David's heart was pounding now. Half the party seemed to be looking their way, including people from his own department who were whispering among themselves. Sterling walked over to the piano bench and patted it dramatically. "I'll tell you what, David. If you can actually play this thing properly, not just bang out some nursery rhyme, I'll make you CEO of this company." The laughter that followed was sharp and uncomfortable. David felt like everyone in the room was staring at him, waiting for him to slink away in embarrassment. This was exactly the kind of public humiliation Sterling was famous for. The way he maintained his dominance by making others feel small. What Sterling didn't know, what none of them knew, was that David Rodriguez wasn't just any piano player. And 3 years of swallowing his pride, 3 years of watching less qualified people get ahead while he stayed invisible, 3 years of pretending to be someone he wasn't had just reached a breaking point. David stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of every stare in the room pressing down on his shoulders. His hands were trembling, not from fear exactly, but from something much deeper. It was like a dam was about to burst inside his chest. 3 years of suppressed passion suddenly fighting to break free. Sterling was still smirking, clearly enjoying the spectacle he'd created. "Come on, David, don't be shy. Show us what you've got. Or maybe you'd prefer to admit that some of us are just built for bigger things than others." The comment stung, but not in the way Sterling intended. Instead of shame, David felt something else rising up inside him. Anger, yes, but also a fierce kind of joy he hadn't experienced in years. His fingers were actually tingling now, muscle memory awakening after being dormant for so long. "You know what?" David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Sure," the word seemed to hang in the air. Sterling's smirk faltered slightly, probably because he'd expected David to back down like he always did. The crowd around them grew larger as people sensed drama unfolding. David walked slowly to the piano bench, each step feeling surreal. His co-workers were probably expecting him to embarrass himself completely. He could practically hear their thoughts. Poor David, always so quiet and awkward, about to make a fool of himself in front of the entire company. He sat down and adjusted the bench, his body automatically remembering the proper posture his first teacher had drilled into him 20 years ago. The familiar weight of the keys beneath his fingertips sent a shiver down his spine. This was a quality instrument, he could tell immediately. The action was perfect, responsive and smooth. For a moment, David just sat there with his hands resting on the keys, letting himself remember what it felt like to be complete. The ballroom had gone surprisingly quiet, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Then he began to play. He started with something simple, just a few gentle chords to test the piano's voice and get his bearings. But even those first notes rang out with a clarity and warmth that seemed to surprise everyone, including himself. The sound was rich and full, filling the space in a way that made conversations stop mid-sentence. David closed his eyes and let muscle memory take over. His fingers found their way to Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most challenging and beautiful pieces in the classical repertoire. It was the piece he'd performed at Carnegie Hall all those years ago, the one that had earned him his first standing ovation. The opening was hauntingly beautiful, a simple melody that seemed to emerge from silence itself. David's touch was delicate but sure, each note perfectly placed and weighted. He hadn't played in 2 years, but it was like his hands remembered every nuance, every subtle dynamic change. As the piece developed, becoming more complex and emotionally intense, David felt himself disappearing into the music the way he used to. The ballroom, the party, even Sterling's mocking face all faded away. There was nothing but the piano and the story it was telling through his fingers. The ballade is a piece that requires not just technical skill but deep emotional maturity. It tells a story without words, moving through moments of tenderness, passion, conflict, and resolution. David had lived enough life since his Carnegie Hall days to understand its depths in a way his younger self never could. People in the crowd were pulling out their phones now, recording the unexpected performance. But David was beyond caring about anything except the music flowing through him. His fingers danced across the keys in the rapid passages, then caressed them gently in the lyrical sections. Sterling's face had gone through a series of changes. First confusion, then surprise, and now something that looked almost like fear. This wasn't what he'd expected at all. He'd wanted to humiliate David, to remind everyone of their place in the corporate hierarchy. Instead, he was watching his quiet employee transform into something magnificent. The other executives looked uncomfortable too, shifting their weight and glancing at each other uncertainly. They were used to being the most impressive people in the room, but suddenly they felt very small next to this extraordinary display of talent. David reached the climax of the piece, his whole body moving with the music as his hands flew across the keyboard. The sound was thunderous and beautiful, every note crystal clear despite the incredible speed and complexity. This was playing at a professional level, the kind of skill that took decades to develop. As he moved into the final section of the ballade, David opened his eyes and looked directly at Sterling. The CEO's face was pale now, the smirk completely gone. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd made a terrible mistake. But David wasn't done. As the ballade came to its gentle, heartbreaking conclusion, he seamlessly transitioned into something even more challenging. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, adapted for solo piano. If the Chopin had been impressive, this was absolutely breathtaking. Rachmaninoff was known for writing music that pushed pianists to their absolute limits. The concerto was famous for its sweeping melodies and thunderous passages that seemed to require more than 10 fingers to execute properly. But David had mastered it years ago, back when he'd dreamed of performing it with major orchestras around the world. The main theme soared out over the crowd, impossibly beautiful and played with a depth of feeling that brought tears to some people's eyes. This wasn't just technical proficiency. This was artistry at its highest level. David was telling his story through the music. All the years of sacrifice and compromise and dreams deferred pouring out through his fingertips. Several people in the crowd were crying now, moved by the raw emotion in the performance. Others stood with their mouths open, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Even the hotel staff had stopped what they were doing to listen. Sterling looked like he wanted to disappear. The man who'd built his reputation on making others feel small was watching one of his employees reveal a talent that dwarfed anything he could ever claim. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. David built to the concerto's massive climax, his entire body involved in creating the thunderous sound that filled every corner of the ballroom. The piano seemed to sing under his hands, every note perfectly placed despite the incredible demands of the music. Then, just as dramatically as it had begun, the music settled into the tender romantic second theme. David's touch became gentle again, coaxing sweetness from the keys that made the contrast even more powerful. He was showing complete mastery over both the technical and emotional aspects of the piece. As he moved toward the final section, David caught sight of his co-workers' faces. They were looking at him like they'd never seen him before, which in a way they hadn't. This was who David really was. Beneath the quiet exterior and the humble acceptance of his corporate role, the concerto rushed toward its conclusion, David's hands flying across the keyboard in passages that would challenge even professional concert pianists. But he made it look effortless, his years of training and natural talent combining to create something truly magical. The final chords rang out into the stunned silence of the ballroom, echoing off the walls before gradually fading away. David sat perfectly still for a moment, his hands resting on the keys, feeling the last vibrations of the strings fade into silence. Then he looked up and saw a room full of people staring at him in complete amazement. Sterling looked like he'd seen a ghost, his face white and his mouth slightly open. The transformation from mocking confidence to shocked disbelief was complete. David stood up slowly from the piano bench, straightened his tie, and looked directly at his CEO. "There you go, Mr. Sterling," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "I played your piano." The silence stretched on for another heartbeat. Then someone in the back of the room started clapping, and suddenly the entire ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. People were cheering, whistling, some still wiping tears from their eyes. But all David could focus on was Sterling's face, and the dawning realization that the man's careless words were about to change both their lives forever. The applause seemed to go on forever, but David barely heard it. He was watching Sterling's face as the CEO processed what had just happened. The man looked like someone had just told him his house was on fire and his insurance had expired. "That was incredible," someone shouted from the crowd. "David, I had no idea you could play like that." More voices joined in, people pushing forward to congratulate him. His quiet coworker Jennifer from HR had tears in her eyes. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard live," she said, shaking her head in amazement. But David kept his eyes on Sterling, who was now surrounded by his own group of executives, all looking extremely uncomfortable. They were whispering urgently among themselves, occasionally glancing over at David with expressions ranging from admiration to worry. Then someone held up their phone. "I got the whole thing on video. This is incredible." That's when David saw Sterling's face change completely. The shock was replaced by something much more dangerous, panic. Because suddenly the CEO realized that his casual promise hadn't just been witnessed by a room full of employees. It had been recorded, and in today's world, recorded meant permanent. "I'm posting this on my social media right now," announced Tom from the marketing department, his thumb already flying across his phone screen. "This needs to be seen by everyone." "Wait," Sterling finally found his voice. "Let's not be hasty here," but it was too late. David could see phones lighting up all around the room as people uploaded videos, sent messages, and shared what they'd just witnessed. The hashtag Piano CEO was already starting to appear in the posts he could glimpse over people's shoulders. Within minutes, David's phone was buzzing with notifications. His sister had seen the video already. Apparently Tom had tagged him in the post and it was spreading fast. "Oh my God," she texted in all caps. "You played again." "And your boss said what?" The hotel staff had stopped pretending to work and were openly watching the drama unfold. The bartender was discreetly recording on his own phone, probably sensing this was going to be a story worth remembering. Sterling tried to regain control of the situation. "Now everyone, let's remember this was just friendly party conversation. David played beautifully, of course, but we shouldn't take every casual comment so seriously." Casual comment? David's voice cut through Sterling's damage control attempt. The room went quiet again, everyone sensing the tension. "You said it in front of everyone here. If you can actually play this thing properly, I'll make you CEO. Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sterling's face flushed red as he realized he'd been backed into a corner of his own making. Around the room, people were still recording, still posting, still sharing the moment with the wider world. David's phone kept buzzing. The notifications were coming faster now. Local news stations were starting to pick up the story from social media. Someone had already created a TikTok video with the hashtag PianoCO challenge. A reporter from the CIT, his biggest newspaper, had sent him a direct message asking for an interview. "This is getting out of hand," one of Sterling's executives whispered urgently. "We need to contain this before it goes any further." But containment was no longer possible. David could see that the story was spreading beyond just their company. People were sharing it because it resonated with something universal. The fantasy of showing up a boss who'd treated you poorly, the dream of hidden talents being recognized, the satisfaction of watching arrogance get its comeuppance. Sterling's assistant rushed over and whispered something in his ear that made his face go even paler. She was probably telling him about the social media explosion that was already happening. The company's PR team was going to have a very busy night. "Mr. Sterling," David said calmly, "you made a promise in front of all these witnesses. Are you planning to keep it?" The crowd was watching like they were at a tennis match, heads turning between David and Sterling with each exchange. But this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a career-defining moment for both men, and everyone in the room knew it. Sterling's phone rang, and David could see it was the company's board chairman calling. The CEO ignored it, but David noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he declined the call. "The video already has 50,000 views," someone announced excitedly. "And it's only been online for 20 minutes. That number sent a visible shudder through Sterling's entire body. 50,000 people had now seen him make a promise he clearly had no intention of keeping, and that number was growing by the minute. David's own phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize with a New York area code. "David Rodriguez. This is Patricia Chen from Good Morning America. We saw the video of your performance and your CEO's promise. We'd love to have you on tomorrow's show to discuss what happens next." He declined the call, but not before several people nearby overheard what it was about. The murmur that went through the crowd was electric. This wasn't just company gossip anymore. This was national news. Sterling's assistant came over again, this time looking genuinely panicked. She whispered something about the company's stock price and emergency board meeting. David couldn't hear the details, but he could see Sterling's face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. "Look," Sterling said, trying to sound reasonable. "David is obviously very talented. Maybe we can discuss a promotion, a raise, something appropriate." "You didn't promise something appropriate," David replied evenly. "You promised to make me CEO if I could play the piano properly." Everyone here heard it. The internet heard it. So the question is simple. Do you keep your word? Or do you explain to everyone watching why your promises don't mean anything? The room was dead silent except for the continued pinging of phone notifications. David could see people's faces in the crowd, and they were all focused on Sterling now, waiting to see what kind of man their CEO really was when the spotlight was on him. Another phone call came in, this time to David's phone. The caller ID showed it was from CNN. He let it go to voicemail but held the phone up so Sterling could see who was calling. The message was clear. This story was going to be told whether Sterling cooperated or not. "The video's at 100,000 views now," Tom updated everyone helpfully, "and there are news crews setting up outside the hotel." Sterling closed his eyes for a moment, probably realizing that his attempt to humiliate David had backfired in the most public way possible. When he opened them, David could see defeat there but also calculation. The CEO was trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to his own reputation. "Fine," Sterling said through gritted teeth. "We'll discuss this properly tomorrow in the office." "With the board? Discuss what?" David pressed. "You made a clear statement. Either you meant it or you didn't." The crowd was getting restless, sensing Sterling's attempt to delay and deflect. Several people called out their own opinions. He said it. "A promise is a promise." David earned it fair and square. David's phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "You're trending on Twitter. Share Piano CEO is the top hashtag in the country right now. I'm so proud of you." He showed the text to Sterling, whose face somehow managed to get even paler. The CEO finally understood that this wasn't going away. There was no spinning this, no controlling the narrative. He'd made a public promise that had been seen by hundreds of thousands of people, and now he had to live with the consequences. The hotel manager approached their group looking nervous. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling, but there are reporters outside asking to speak with both you and Mr. Rodriguez. What would you like me to tell them?" Sterling looked around the room desperately as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. His executives were backing away from him now, probably trying to distance themselves from what they could see was becoming a public relations disaster. David felt a strange calm settle over him. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't the one who was powerless in this situation. "I think," he said quietly, "it's time for you to decide what kind of person you want to be, Mr. Sterling. The kind who keeps his word, or the kind who makes promises he never intended to honor." The silence that followed was deafening. broken only by the continued buzzing of phones as the story spread further and further into the digital world, carrying with it the potential to change everything. The boardroom had never felt so tense. David sat at the long mahogany table, still wearing his best suit from the night before, though he'd gone home to shower and change shirts. Across from him, Sterling looked like he hadn't slept at all. Dark circles under his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands told the story of a man who'd spent the entire night dealing with a crisis he'd created for himself. The rest of the board members filed in one by one, their expressions ranging from curious to deeply concerned. Board Chairman Patricia Williams took her seat at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. "Before we begin," she said, looking directly at Sterling, "I want everyone to understand the situation we're dealing with. As of this morning, the video of last night's incident has been viewed over 2 million times. It's been covered by every major news outlet in the country. Our stock price dropped 12% in pre-market trading, and our phones haven't stopped ringing with calls from investors, customers, and reporters." Sterling slumped deeper into his chair. David could see the man was realizing the full scope of what his careless words had set in motion. "The hashtag Piano CEO is trending worldwide," Patricia continued, reading from a tablet. "There are memes, reaction videos, and news segments analyzing the situation. The general consensus seems to be that our company culture needs serious examination, and that Mr. Rodriguez here is being treated unfairly." One of the board members, an older gentleman David recognized as the head of the finance committee, leaned forward. "Robert, help me understand this. You publicly promised to make this young man CEO if he could play the piano properly. By all accounts, his performance was extraordinary. So what exactly is the problem?" Sterling cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, obviously it was just a figure of speech." "I didn't literally mean, it didn't sound like a figure of speech on the video," another board member interrupted. "It sounded like a public commitment made in front of dozens of witnesses." David had been quiet until now, letting the board members process the situation for themselves. But he could see that Sterling was trying to minimize what had happened, and he wasn't going to let that stand. "Mr. Sterling has a pattern of making statements he doesn't intend to honor," David said calmly. "In the 3 years I've worked for this company, I've submitted multiple proposals for improving our processes and efficiency. Each time I was told they would be taken under consideration. None of them ever were. When I asked for feedback or meetings to discuss implementation, I was told there wasn't time or budget." He pulled out a folder he'd brought with him. "These are copies of all my proposals along with the email responses I received. I think you'll find they demonstrate a pattern of dismissiveness toward employee contributions." Patricia took the folder and began flipping through it, her eyebrows rising as she read. "These are quite detailed, and some of these suggestions could have saved the company significant money. Why weren't they implemented?" Sterling shifted in his seat. "We get hundreds of suggestions from employees. We can't pursue every idea, but you can publicly humiliate the people who submit them?" David's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. "Because that's what last night was really about. You saw an opportunity to embarrass someone you considered beneath you, and you took it." The room fell silent as the board members absorbed this. David could see several of them exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. His phone buzzed with another notification. The messages hadn't stopped coming since the video went viral. Job offers from competing companies, invitations to perform at events, interview requests from major media outlets. His LinkedIn profile had been viewed thousands of times overnight. "I should mention," David continued, "that I've received several interesting calls this morning. 3 of our biggest competitors have offered me positions with significant salary increases and leadership responsibilities. 2. Music conservatories want me to join their business programs as a consultant, and I have standing invitations to appear on every major morning show to discuss workplace culture and employee recognition." Sterling's face went white. Losing David to a competitor would be bad enough, but having him on national television discussing his treatment at Pinnacle Corporation would be a public relations nightmare. Patricia set down the folder of proposals and looked directly at Sterling. "Robert, I'm going to ask you a direct question and I want a direct answer. Do you believe David Rodriguez has been treated fairly during his time with this company?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Sterling looked around the table, seeing no sympathetic faces, no allies willing to help him deflect. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Perhaps there could have been better communication regarding his contributions. That's not what I asked, Patricia said sharply. I asked if he's been treated fairly. Sterling's shoulders sagged. No, probably not. The admission seemed to deflate him completely. David felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity watching the man who'd made his work life miserable finally acknowledge the truth. Now, Patricia continued, let's address the elephant in the room. You made a public promise that has been seen by millions of people. The integrity of this company is now tied to how we handle this situation. What do you propose we do? Sterling was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the answer. Finally, he looked up at David with something that might have been respect in his eyes. I think I should honor my commitment. If David wants the CEO position, it's his. The words seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including David himself. He'd expected Sterling to fight harder, to find some way to weasel out of his promise. But David had had all night to think about what he really wanted, and his answer surprised everyone even more. I appreciate that, Mr. Sterling, but I don't want to be CEO. The silence that followed was profound. Patricia blinked in confusion. I'm sorry, what? I said I don't want to be CEO, David repeated calmly. I never did. What I want is to be treated with respect. I want my ideas to be heard and considered on their merits. I want to work for a company that values all of its employees, not just the ones in the executive suite. He looked around the table at each board member. Making me CEO wouldn't solve the real problem here. The real problem is a culture that allows talented people to be dismissed and humiliated simply because they don't fit someone's idea of what leadership looks like. Sterling was staring at him now with something approaching wonder. Then what do you want? David smiled for the first time since entering the boardroom. I want to create a new position, Chief Innovation Officer, someone whose job is to find and develop the hidden talents in our workforce, to make sure good ideas get heard regardless of where they come from. I want to implement the employee suggestion program I proposed 2 years ago, and I want to make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else here. Patricia was nodding slowly. That's actually quite reasonable, and probably exactly what this company needs right now. There's one more thing, David added. I want to establish a music program for employees. Stress relief, team building, creative expression. There might be other people here with hidden talents that could benefit everyone if they were encouraged instead of ignored. Around the table, heads were nodding. This wasn't the vindictive power grab they'd expected. This was a thoughtful plan for genuine improvement. Sterling looked up at David with something that might have been admiration. You could have destroyed me. You could have taken everything. Why didn't you? David considered the question for a moment. Because destroying you wouldn't have made anything better. But changing how we treat people, that might actually make a difference. The transformation in the room was palpable. What had started as a crisis management meeting had become something else entirely. A conversation about how to build a better workplace for everyone. Patricia smiled for the first time all morning. I think we have a deal. David, welcome to your new role as Chief Innovation Officer. Robert, I think you have some work to do rebuilding trust with your employees. As they shook hands around the table, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope for the future. Not just his future, but everyone's. 6 months later, David Rodriguez walked through the halls of Pinnacle Corporation and marveled at how different everything felt. The same fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The same gray carpeting stretched down the corridors, but the energy was completely transformed. He paused outside the break room, where he could hear laughter and animated conversation. Through the glass door, he saw Jennifer from HR teaching Tom from marketing how to play guitar during their lunch break. The employee music program had started small, just a few people meeting once a week, but it had grown into something special. David, called out Lisa, one of the accountants who'd been with the company for over a decade. Are you coming to the talent show planning meeting this afternoon? He smiled and nodded. The monthly talent shows had become one of the company's most popular events. Last month, they'd discovered that their quiet night janitor was an incredible poet, and the tough-as-nails security chief could sing opera. It turned out Sterling had been right about one thing. There were extraordinary people everywhere, just waiting for someone to notice. David's phone buzzed with a text from his sister. Saw the Forbes article about Pinnacle's workplace transformation? So proud of you. Also, Mom wants to know when you're giving your TED Talk. The TED Talk was scheduled for next month. From invisible to invaluable, recognizing hidden talent in the workplace. It was part of a speaking tour that had grown out of the piano incident, as people had started calling it. David had been invited to conferences, universities, and corporate events around the country to share what they'd learned about employee engagement and workplace culture. But the real satisfaction came from seeing the daily changes at Pinnacle. The suggestion box David had implemented was overflowing with ideas every week, and more importantly, those ideas were being reviewed, discussed, and often implemented. The company had saved over $2 million in the past 6 months, just from employee suggestions that had previously been ignored. David stopped by Sterling's office, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The door was open, and he could see the CEO on a video call with what looked like a group of college students. Remember, Sterling was saying, leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about recognizing the smart people around you and giving them the tools to succeed. When the call ended, Sterling waved David in. The man looked different now, less rigid, more approachable. The corporate power suits had been replaced with more casual attire, and he actually smiled when employees passed him in the hallways. How did the university leadership seminar go? David asked, settling into one of the chairs across from Sterling's desk. Good, I think. Though I have to admit it's still strange being asked for advice on workplace culture. Sterling shook his head ruefully. 6 months ago, I was the poster child for everything wrong with corporate leadership. It was true. The initial backlash from the piano incident had been brutal. Sterling had faced calls for his resignation, scathing editorials about toxic workplace culture, and even protests outside the company building. But instead of circling the wagons or trying to deflect blame, he'd done something unexpected. He'd admitted his mistakes and committed to changing. The transformation hadn't been easy. Sterling had enrolled in leadership coaching, attended sensitivity training, and spent hours in one-on-one conversations with employees he'd previously barely acknowledged. Some people remained skeptical, but most had been willing to give him a second chance when they saw genuine effort to change. The employee satisfaction scores came in this morning, David said, pulling out his tablet. 93% positive, up from 47% 6 months ago. And our retention rate is the best in the industry now. Sterling whistled softly. I still can't believe how much things have changed. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made that stupid comment about the piano. You would have found another way to humiliate someone eventually, David said with a slight smile. And maybe that person wouldn't have been able to fight back the way I could. So in a weird way, maybe it all worked out exactly as it was supposed to. They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Patricia Williams, the board chairman, stuck her head in. David, do you have a minute? I wanted to discuss the expansion of your innovation program to our other offices. The success at Pinnacle's headquarters had attracted attention from their other locations around the country. Everyone wanted to implement similar programs, which meant David would be traveling more, consulting with other offices, and probably hiring a team to help manage the growing initiative. Actually, Patricia continued, I have some interesting news. Harvard Business School wants to do a case study on our transformation. They're calling it the Piano Protocol, using unexpected moments to reveal hidden potential in organizations. David laughed. The Piano Protocol? I like that. After Patricia left, Sterling turned to David with a serious expression. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Do you ever regret not taking the CEO position when you had the chance? You could have had everything. The corner office, the 7-figure salary, all of it. David considered the question while looking out the window at the bustling city below. In the distance, he could see the hotel where everything had changed that night 6 months ago. You know what I have now that I never would have had as CEO? He said finally. I have the piano. Sterling looked confused. What do you mean? Come with me. David led Sterling down to the main lobby where a beautiful upright piano sat in a place of honor. It was the same piano from the hotel. The company had purchased it and moved it to their offices as a reminder of that transformative night. I play for about 30 minutes every lunch break, David explained. Sometimes people stop and listen, sometimes they don't. But I get to play again every single day. As CEO, I would have been so busy with board meetings and quarterly reports and corporate politics that I never would have had time for music. As if to demonstrate his point, David sat down and began playing a gentle melody. Within minutes, people had gathered around, employees on their lunch breaks, visitors in the lobby, even a few delivery workers who'd paused to listen. Sterling watched the small crowd that had formed, seeing the peaceful expressions on people's faces as they listened. "You chose this over power and money?" "I chose this over your version of power and money," David corrected. "But look around. I have influence here that I never could have had before. I have the trust and respect of people throughout the company. I wake up every morning excited about the work I'm doing. How many CEOs can say that?" The melody David was playing was one he'd composed himself, a piece he called Hidden Harmonies. It had become something of an anthem for the workplace transformation, representing the idea that everyone had something beautiful to contribute if given the chance. When he finished playing, the small crowd applauded and began to disperse back to their various activities. Sterling remained standing beside the piano, lost in thought. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" Sterling said finally. "That night at the party, I thought I was putting you in your place. I thought I was reminding everyone about the natural order of things, about who belonged where. But what I actually did was show everyone, including myself, that the natural order was completely wrong." David closed the piano bench and stood up. "Maybe that's the most important lesson from all of this. The people we overlook, the ones we dismiss as unimportant, they might be the ones with the most to offer. We just have to be willing to listen." As they walked back toward the elevators together, David reflected on how much had changed, not just for him but for everyone at Pinnacle. The company had been featured in business magazines as an example of successful cultural transformation. Their stock price had not only recovered but reached an all-time high. Most importantly, people actually wanted to work there now. The elevator arrived, and as they stepped inside, Sterling turned to David one more time. "I owe you an apology that I never properly gave. Not just for that night, but for 3 years of not seeing what was right in front of me." "Apology accepted," David said simply. "But more importantly, you've shown that people can change. That's worth more than any apology." As the elevator rose toward their respective floors, David thought about the TED Talk he'd be giving next month, and all the other companies that had reached out asking for help with their own workplace transformations. The piano incident, as surreal as it had been, had started something bigger than either of them had imagined. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the recognition, or the speaking opportunities, or even the significant salary increase that had come with his new role. It was in the knowledge that he'd helped create a place where talented people didn't have to hide who they were, where good ideas were valued regardless of their source, and where a quiet accountant with hidden musical gifts could become exactly who he was meant to be. The elevator dinged softly as it reached David's floor, and he stepped out into a workplace that had been transformed not by force or manipulation, but by the simple recognition that everyone deserves the chance to show what they're capable of. Sometimes, he thought as he walked toward his office, the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places.